there are lots of other people that are interested in freedom. The entire American right claims that they want freedom, don't they? It's kind of wrapped up in there.
I have numbers to give on this.
Oh, really?
Should I break out the numbers?
Go on, bring out the numbers.
Right, so have a look at what's on the screen now. So this is, this shows how bad the Democrats were during the pandemic, but the red bar is the Republicans as well. I mean, just take this one. Send unvaccinated to quarantine camps. So basically, modern concentration camps. As you can see there, over 20% of Republicans were in favour of that. What's the blue bar? Was that 50, 45, 50%, something like that? We're in favour of sending people to concentration camps because the TV told them to be scared. So,
it's not looking good, is it?
There are. So yes, there are freedom-minded people in the US and the UK, probably more in the US, to be fair.
A decent number more, I would say. Yeah.
Because even if you're on the right in this country, you still worship our NHS.
Weird, isn't it?
Yes.
I don't really understand.
So there are certainly more of them in the US, but let's not think that it's by all means, all on the right.
I wouldn't say all of them, because of course there are some people who purport to be on the right that don't necessarily pull rank.
Yes, like the Conservative Party or the Republican Party.
Yeah,
when they're all just status chills.
Well, I'm of the opinion that corporations.
Like Rand Paul. I mean, he's all right.
He's not as good as his dad, but he's a bit too on the status side for me. But
yes,
I would also caution against polls more generally, because particularly Rasmussen, they've released some somewhat suspicious polls that seem to indicate levels of public support for things that your ordinary person would think would be horrifying, let alone someone who follows politics. And the way that polling sometimes works is that the people conducting the polls tend to be people who weren't able to get a job in academia. So therefore, they tend to be not very good at controlling for factors that they should be, and the statistical analysis can be sometimes quite weak, although it's difficult to mess up a bar graph.
To be fair, the British version of that is going to be YouTube.
YouGov.
YouGov. When they produced some very suspicious polls.
And I think that it's basically manufacturing consent would be the way I would put it.
But I don't think that, I think they are gaming the polls. I don't think they are completely fabricating them.
No, because they still want it to be believable.
There is a decent number of people who were all in favour of concentration camps, even those who identified as Republicans in the past years. Now, I'm using that as an extreme example, but it's the case amongst so many things at the moment, and the obvious example here is going to be our NHS. That thinking afflicts even people who are sort of quite pro right wing, and we are so far off base, and I think it has to be the system that we're operating on. I just don't think that the libertarianism is compatible with democracy or the financial system that we have. So while those conditions are present, I think that it's a waste of time to be pushing libertarian arguments.
So You've identified these two problems. Obviously, you've got the way that politics works in terms of democracy. Minority movements struggle to get off the ground. That's fair enough. I agree with those points. And also that the financial system isn't sustainable, basically. But isn't that setting up for the inevitability of it having to change at some point? Is it?
Yes.
And if so, do you think it's going to become more authoritarian in its place to mitigate for the lack of trust, or is it going to have to relent and grant people some freedoms back? Because if, in kind of my reading of history, when governments basically fail to deliver what they're supposed to, then kind of people are left up on their own, and you wouldn't necessarily call that a free system necessarily. But again, I don't care what things are called. I don't care about the political theory behind them. I care about tangible real world results for people on the ground. So I find labeling something like labeling freedom as a libertarian principle. I find that pointless, because who cares? I mean, I'd prefer to point to the actual policy that grants people more freedom than otherwise, say privatizing, the NHS. So you've got freedom to choose which healthcare provider. I mean, if only the left were right about how much the Tories wanted to privatize it, I might be a bit more of a happy man. But
yes. So if you're asking for my prediction, I think we are going to basically be ground down over the course of the next decade. So again, going back to my USSR example, yes, it did collapse, but it was decades and decades after it started to just fail spectacularly. Well, from the earliest days, it was because it was operating on a flawed economic model. We are today operating on a flawed political and economic model, but we are still relatively prosperous, and it is easy to see the flaws in this when you look back over a period of decades. So if you compare the ability for somebody born in 1956 to have a good career, have a home, foreign holidays throughout their life, all that kind of thing, compared to somebody born in, say, 1996, the differences are quite marked on that. But the differences from any one year to the next are slight. And the incentives to stay in line are strong, because you always lose more from any sort of particular deviation from the consensus that we have at the moment. If you put yourself outside the system, it's very difficult to operate. So the incentive is always basically to grumble but nod along. So I mean, the best that I think I can do is make very clear through the content and discussions that I have why the system is failing. So nobody is under any illusions as to why it is, because of course there's always going to be people who are going to say, oh well, the system's failing because we're not taxing enough, or we've not centralized control enough, or we're not clamping down on people who think that gender is a binary, or whatever the latest lunacy is going to be. There's always going to be people for that. But I want to make it very clear why the current system is failing, so that people can reject it, and where alternatives do present themselves, such as Bitcoin, for example, or effectively the only alternative financial system at this point is really going to be Bitcoin, unless you're a nation state, in which case gold can have a role in this, and that's the best you can do. But other than highlighting these failings, so that when an opportunity arises, a sufficient number of people are able to make the right connections as to why it's failed and not repeat those mistakes. I mean, really what I'm doing is I'm trying to talk to the people who are going to be of the age to be the decision makers at the point when it matters, which might be the Zoomers. Maybe by the time they're in their 40s and 50s, they will be the decision makers who will pick us up from the other side of this. And if they've got the right set of assumptions, that they can implement a superior system. But as for implementing a libertarian mindset today, all I see that it does is just makes it easier for our enemies.
Well, I don't necessarily agree with that part, but I do agree with everything else you said there. And I think that you're right to say that it's going to be stretched out. There's not going to be some sort of coming event that's going to change the political system. I think it's going to continue to degrade over time until it can't continue anymore.
To be fair, all of this, I think, in probability distributions. So it is possible there is an event that causes a sudden financial chain reaction, dominoes falling thing. But I just think the most likely outcome is going to be that slow decline.
I mean, there could be some sort of technological innovation that mitigates some of the worst excesses and basically acts as some sort of life support for the system, which might actually extend it even further than we might think, which I think there are actually strong arguments for that. So I did a video on this big ideas, and so there's a US investment house called ARC who look at developing technological trends such as robotics and AI and various other things. And they projected that if these technologies come to fruition, you could be seeing growth rates in the Western world of over 10% a year.
Now, that is an extraordinary level of growth.
Yeah, that's sort of China at its sort of peak, isn't it? If you can trust their figures, of course.
Yeah, except China was its peak was basically a debt mirage. I mean, there was underlying economic growth.
I've done a lot of digging with the Chinese economy, and I think the growth figure is one of the few parts of it that was actually positive, because, of course, they've built their economy on debt even as much as we have, if not more, in some cases. Certainly at the local governmental level, they've got basically a catastrophe if they carry on using the same system. But I think because they do have the centralized power, they have the ability to spot it and reform it as well. Yeah. So there is that.
If we were to get the technological trends that ARC's talking about in terms of growth, and we get that sort of 10% plus a year growth, real growth, rather than just debt-fueled growth, that would be sufficient to rescue us from this current debt trap that we're in at the moment. But the flip side of that, it would also rescue the corrupt and broken political system that we have.
Yeah.
So you'd then be in the difficult situation where you've got a state which is addicted to ever more spending and centralization of power, coupled with an economic miracle that gets them out of the bind that would otherwise destroy them. But that might still be the least worst option, because a total economic collapse would be utterly horrendous
for everybody
involved. So, I mean, there are potential ways out of it, but
I see that sort of scenario being the most inevitable out of all of them. And although I'm more optimistic than you about the future and the notion that there could be freedom, I'm also not deluded. And I think that, that likelihood isn't massive, but I think there are arguments that don't get put forward.
So what arguments do you make today for libertarian principles?
Well, I've got quite a few. I mean, this entire Contemplations, right? More or less. But what I did want to touch on, to build on what you were saying earlier, that we haven't talked about, which is certainly a limitation to the furtherance of these principles, is that, well, most elites want to keep government spending high, don't they? And there is a multitude of reasons for that. But lucrative government contracts, pretty good one. Government subsidies in certain industries, which makes it very easy to turn a profit. In fact, you're almost guaranteed to turn a profit. You get grants, tax incentives as well. And particularly in Europe, where we're competing with the United States, we're willing to bend over far more for companies so they base themselves here rather than the States. And therefore, the state actually gets a lot less out of them. And although that seems like some sort of libertarian victory, it's actually not, because we're getting the worst of both worlds, because we've just got a foreign company that may bring some jobs and a bit of wealth in, but it's not nearly as productive as, saying, a homegrown industry based here that's been built from the ground up and pays their taxes. Yeah,
so if we're getting onto the sort of economic side of things, I mean, the classic libertarian economic principles, the Ricardian principles, again, there was a time that I would have gone for all of that. Increasingly, I'm starting to think that, no, that's not really it. I mean, you get a lot of our political class who fall into that, who feel that, economic line go up is the be-all and end-all. I'm increasingly thinking, no. I mean, who cares? Like Brexit, for example, I don't care if it makes us poorer. I don't think it will, but I don't care if it does, because I think there are higher principles at work here. The immigration argument. I'm fine with a small amount of immigration, but nowhere near the amount that we have at the moment.
I very much agree.
So I'm pro borders, and the libertarians, especially if they're the more purist libertarians, will be no borders at all.
I get very frustrated with this, because you can use the example of, well, why do you put locks on your door? Oh, to protect your private property. Oh, why are there borders? Oh, wait, this is the same principle. It's that,
but a purist libertarian will be no border controls.
Yes, and I think that those are people who have learnt everything they know from books rather than looking at the real world. And I get very frustrated with people like that. So I'm like, you've learned your theory very well. I'm sure you're going to get great marks in your exam, but it doesn't really map on to the real world.
Yeah, they will get great marks in the exam, and then they'll end up leading the Tory party.
Yeah.
That's what happens. And it's all about line go up with these people. It's about how can we increase GDP the most?
People need to be a bit more realistic about the state of the world. I mean,
and the state of the Tory party. Stop voting for them.
I didn't. in the local elections. I support my ballots, which is how you get them to change, if at all. I would prefer to destroy them personally. I mean, I'm never going to vote Conservative again. In fact, I'm probably not going to vote for any party ever again. But
I think there's some merit to the smaller parties, even though they're not perfect. You know, a vote for like a reform or a claim feels
problem
like
is that they don't run in most places. Like, I'm not able to vote for them. That's the main problem. Is
you could stand for them. That's
true, but then I have to pay to do that. You have to pay a fee. And be like, oh yeah, pay a fee just to be resoundingly defeated. Great. So it's a bit of a waste of time. I suppose it's something to say, oh yeah, I stood as an...
And lost thoroughly, yes. But, you know, gave it the best shot.
But my point in raising that elites want to keep government spending high is this is kind of how... it's a very easy way of generating money. And it kind of, through putting money through the political system and through having high taxes, it puts more chips on the table to be won, I think is a fair way of putting it.
Let's be clear, when we say generate money, we mean generate money so we talk about stealing money. It's a very effective way to steal money.
Yes, I don't know why I'm being so euphemistic. I hate these people, but...
yes. But yeah, big state, you keep it in your orbit, and what you're doing is you're increasing the amount of money at your disposal to direct at your largesse. You're increasing your power. And also, like you also mentioned, the subsidies and the sort of state-awarded spending. You know, a particularly pertinent example at the moment is, of course, going to be the military-industrial complex. You know, we're cycling money into that. 2 years ago, it was Big Pharma. You know, the amount of kickbacks that were coming back the other way. Before that, it was the big banks. And you have situations where, you know, you're the chief of staff for Theresa May, and then you go and get a job paying 500 grand a year at Goldman Sachs as soon as you retire. Wouldn't surprise me if some of the people who are retiring out now go and work for Big Pharma. Wouldn't surprise me if in 5 years' time the people getting out go and work for, you know, big military contractors. And this is how it works. You cycle the money.
And the cycle of money is very good at controlling people as well, in that, to use the example of the Conservative Party, a third of their donors are property developers. And mysteriously enough, Conservatives are all in favour of building new houses, despite their voter base being largely against immigration and the need to build more houses in the first place. Lots of people protesting at the notion of expanding their small, quaint towns. And yet,
I thread that one slightly differently myself. I mean, they're not really in favour of building new houses because so few of them get built. I mean, in this country,
I think I posed it a little bit wrong. What a more accurate way of representing what I believe is that they get immigration in to increase the demand for housing, which then allows the property developers to make more profits on the houses they do build.
Yeah, immigration is a factor in house prices, but it is not the main or the second or even the third contributing factor.
Okay.
So it is a factor, but it's not a big factor. The thing with house building is house building policy is kind of engineered to ensure that few houses are built, and they are only built by a small group of people who can navigate the complex environment to get it done. And prices keep high on that one. I would like to see more houses built because I think that young people deserve to have homes. You don't need to do it on the edge of some pretty village. There were plenty of brownfield sites that could be utilised for this, but again, planning restrictions stop a lot of that happening. So I do take a slightly different view on that, but I don't think the Tory party are pro house building at all. They are pro the amount that suits the big developers. That's probably a better way of putting it, I would say.
Yeah, that's what I meant to say, but just phrased it poorly, I think.
Because the legal restrictions, the building regulations and the planning restrictions are so difficult to navigate if you're not one of the major contractors. And even if you are one of the major contractors, it's still difficult to deal with. So, I mean, the market for prostitution and illicit drugs in the UK is bigger than our house building market. So, you know, my obvious take back from that is if you want to see more houses built, you should make it illegal.
As in,
and I'm being make house building illegal, and you'll see more of it. I'm being slightly tongue in cheek there, but the point I'm making is, if people were able to ignore, the whole set of housing policies and restrictive regulations that came along with that, you would probably see more of it happening. I mean, I suppose a house is slightly more difficult to hide than a baggie of weed or whatever. But you get my point. It's the government's restrictions that are the principal factor there.
Mm-hmm. I very much agree. Awfully libertarian of you as well.
Well, I believe in this stuff. I just don't believe it could work. So
I don't believe it
in terms of a libertarian state. What we need to do is we need to do something closer to a Bukele. Mm-hmm. And we need to win the reins of power and crush our enemies before they crush us.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.